In a world where every emotion is digitized, we search for the rare, flickering pulse of a genuine human heart. Explore the deep connection between man and machine in our latest high-contrast cinematic series. Click subscribe now and witness the beautiful collision of humanity and technology today.
Match. Danny Kowalski was 2 bites into his beef brisket sandwich when he looked across the table at me and said, "Come on, Daniel, tell Hector the whole thing. Start from the beginning." We were at Sal's Diner on Richmond Avenue, 4 of us who'd served together in the Army Corps of Engineers, and somehow all ended up doing infrastructure work in Houston after our discharges. Thursday lunch, same booth we claimed for 12 years. Hector Reyes had just transferred back from a project in San Antonio and missed the entire episode that had turned my life upside down, and then right side up again. "I heard pieces," Hector said, unwrapping a straw. "Something about you getting fired and then the guy who fired you losing everything. That true?" "That's the short version," Danny said, grinning. Hector looked at me. "I got time." I pushed my coffee mug to the side and leaned back. "My name is Daniel Hargrove. I'm 54 years old, retired Army after 16 years as a combat engineer, 2 tours in Iraq building forward operating bases and repairing blown bridges under fire conditions. After my discharge, I went back to school on the GI Bill, got my structural engineering license, and spent the next 18 years at Stanton Civil Solutions, a mid-size infrastructure firm here in Houston that specialized in flood control systems, highway overpasses, and levee reinforcement contracts for the Army Corps in the state of Texas. Not glamorous work, but when a hurricane comes through and the levees hold, you sleep fine. "You have to understand who Ray Stanton was," I told Hector, before I explained what Brandon did. Raymond Stanton had founded the company in 1987 with a pickup truck, a transit level, and a contact at the Harris County Flood Control District. By the time I joined 18 years ago, Stanton Civil had grown to about 340 employees and held government contracts worth close to $400 million over a 10-year pipeline. Ray was 62 when I came aboard. White-haired, barrel-chested, a man who wore the same Carhartt jacket every winter and remembered the name of every field technician's spouse. He'd never served, but he had the instincts of a good commander. He understood that the people who did the actual work were the ones who deserved protecting. Ray and I hit it off immediately. He saw something in my background, the precision of military engineering combined with an understanding of what happens when structures fail under stress, that he said was rare in the civilian side. Within 3 years, I was his director of structural innovation. Within 5, I had built something called the Hargrove Load Distribution Model, a proprietary calculation system for designing levee reinforcement structures that reduced material cost by around 22% while increasing load tolerance. The Texas Department of Transportation had incorporated it to their standard specifications. The Army Corps had used it on 14 major flood control projects across the Gulf Coast. That software was the crown jewel of Stanton Civil Solutions. It was the reason we won contracts over firms twice our size. About 9 years ago, Ray pulled me aside after a company cookout at his place in Katy. We ended up sitting on his back porch watching his grandkids chase lightning bugs around the yard, and he handed me a glass of Pappy Van Winkle, the real stuff, not the kind people pretend they've had. "Daniel," he said, "I'm writing something into your employment agreement." I waited. Ray wasn't a man who spoke before he was ready. "That annual performance payment you receive, the milestone bonus tied to the model's licensing revenue. When it pays out each year, the usage rights to the Hargrove model stay with the company. Clean and automatic. But if you're ever separated from this company within 48 hours of that payment, before or after those rights transfer permanently and exclusively to you, not to Stanton Civil. To Daniel Hargrove, individual." I stared at him. "Ray, that's worth about $22 million in current licensing value, yes." He took a sip of bourbon without blinking. "My daughter is going to inherit this business when I'm gone, Daniel. I love her more than anything on earth, but she married a man I don't fully trust with something this important. I want to know that what you built can't be used carelessly, that it stays protected." I thought he was being dramatic. His daughter, Carolyn, was smart and measured. Her husband, Brandon Whitfield, was young and aggressive, but I'd only seen him at company holiday parties making loud jokes and bragging about his Porsche. Ray's old general counsel drew up the clause in language tight enough to survive a federal court challenge. I signed it, filed it away in the back of my mind, and mostly forgot about it. 2 years ago, Ray had a stroke. He recovered partially, but stepped back completely from operations. Carolyn took the CEO role. I respected her enough. She stayed out of the technical side, trusted her senior staff, kept the trains running. For about 4 months, things were fine. Then Brandon started showing up to the office. I'd seen this type before. I told Hector. 31 years old, Stanford MBA, 0 field experience, but absolutely certain that his intelligence entitled him to an opinion on everything. Hector shook his head slowly. Oh, I know that type. Brandon Whitfield became Chief Strategy Officer, which was a title Carolyn apparently invented to give him something official. He sat in on client meetings, challenged engineering decisions he didn't have the background to evaluate, and referred to the licensed Hargrove model and budget presentations as the algorithm, the way someone talks about a microwave. Just a tool, just a line item. 6 months ago, Brandon decided to restructure. That's the word they always use. Restructure. It means someone who has no idea how anything actually functions has decided to rearrange the parts. He cut 3 senior engineers from the Levy division, 2 of whom had 30 years of combined Gulf Coast field experience between them. He hired a 26-year-old data analyst from Austin who had never set foot on a job site and gave her the title of Infrastructure Optimization Lead. He pushed through a proposal to sublicense the Hargrove model to a competitor firm in Louisiana without consulting me on the technical transfer requirements. I flagged it. He overrode my flag. The Louisiana firm used it incorrectly on a drainage project and the state rejected their submission. That cost Stanton Civil a contract referral relationship we cultivated for 11 years. None of that was why he fired me, though. He fired me because I made him look small in front of people who mattered. The Harris County Flood Control District had scheduled a technical review meeting for our proposed levee reinforcement bid on the Addicks Reservoir expansion, a contract worth $68 million. Commissioner Patricia Wynn was there, along with 2 Army Corps project managers and a federal infrastructure compliance officer named Richard Bates, who had worked with going back to 2009. These were not people who appreciated being handled. They were engineers and public servants who had watched Harvey flood 50,000 homes and were not in the mood for salesmanship. Brandon walked in 15 minutes late, wearing a suit that looked like it belonged at a real estate closing. He hadn't reviewed the technical submission packet I'd sent him 3 days prior. I knew this because his first comment was a restatement of a point that the packet had already addressed in the second paragraph. Commissioner Wynn raised an eyebrow. Richard Bates, who knew my work going back over a decade, turned and gave me a look that said everything without saying anything. Brandon kept going. He started talking about scalable model deployment and algorithm monetization pathways in a room full of people who wanted to discuss soil saturation coefficients and tidal surge calculations. He referenced a cost reduction projection that was based on the Louisiana firm's botched application, numbers that were not only wrong but that Richard Bates would recognize as wrong because his office had been copied on the rejection. I stayed quiet as long as I could. Then I said calmly that I'd like to walk through the technical compliance section directly and asked if we could redirect to page 14 of the submission. Brandon stopped mid-sentence and looked at me like I'd interrupted something important. We recovered the meeting. Commissioner Nguyen and I spoke for 40 minutes about load distribution specifics. Richard Bates asked pointed questions I could answer with precision. By the end, the room had shifted. The contract was still in play. After the clients left, Brandon pulled me into a conference room, closed the door, and told me I had undermined him in front of major stakeholders and that it was a terminable offense. I told him the meeting had gone well. He told me that wasn't the point. I told him I understood. And I did. His ego had been the biggest structure in that room, and I had accidentally load tested it. Danny leaned across the table at Sal's diner, and that was it, right? That was the thing. That was the ignition, I said, but the fuse had been burning for a year. 3 days later, Brandon called me into Carolyn's office. She was there but didn't speak. She kept her eyes on the table in front of her, and I understood in that moment that she was not in agreement with what was happening, but had decided her marriage was more load-bearing than my employment. Brandon slid a termination letter across the desk with the practiced calm of a man who had rehearsed the moment. My position was being eliminated. Effective immediately. A severance packet was attached. The date on that letter was a Tuesday. My annual performance and licensing milestone payment was scheduled for Thursday, 72 hours away. I looked at the letter for a moment, then I picked up the pen and signed the acknowledgement line without a word. No raised voice. No negotiation. No display of the thing he was clearly hoping to provoke. I folded my copy, buttoned my jacket, and thanked Carolyn for the opportunity to serve the company. Brandon looked like he'd expected a different show. At the door, I stopped and turned back to him. I'd recommend reading through the full licensing agreement structure before you close the Louisiana Sublicense Amendment, particularly the dependency clauses. His expression was unreadable. He had no idea what I was referring to. That was exactly the problem. Hector was sitting forward now, both elbows on the table. He didn't know about the Stanton clause. He'd never read a contract longer than a term sheet in his life, I said. I went home to my house in Sugar Land, changed into running clothes, and did a 6-mile loop through the neighborhood. I learned from 16 years in the Army that panic is a decision and patience is a discipline. I wasn't panicking. I was counting. 71 hours and 40 minutes. The calls started before I finished stretching on my front steps. My old colleague James Petrov from the Levy Division, who'd heard already through the grapevine that reaches 60 miles before lunch in the Houston engineering community. Then Sandra Okafor, who ran structural compliance at a competing firm and had tried to recruit me twice. Then a general contractor I'd partnered with on a Sugar Land drainage project who called just to say what he thought of the decision, using language that was colorful and entirely accurate. The Houston infrastructure world is not large. When someone with 2 decades of flood control experience and an active Army Corps relationship suddenly becomes available, everyone knows before the ink dries. I was heating up leftover chicken and rice when my phone showed a number I recognized but hadn't expected. Walter Chen, the project director from the Harris County Flood Control District. Not Commissioner Nguyen's office. Walter directly. Daniel. Word reached us about the personnel change at Stanton. Walter. I want to ask you directly. Are you still with them? As of about 4 this afternoon, no. A pause. Daniel. We have a technical compliance concern with the attic submission. Some of the load distribution calculations in the secondary levy section reference the Hargrove model in a way our compliance officer flagged, specifically a question about licensing continuity and whether the model application is valid if the licensing holder changes status. I sat down at my kitchen table. That's an interesting question, Walter. I thought you might think so. Is there anything you want to tell me about the licensing structure? Not yet, I said. Give me 48 hours. He understood. Walter Chen had been a project engineer before he moved to the district side. He understood that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the time between when a thing breaks and when everyone else notices it's broken. 68 hours. I called my son that evening. Marcus was finishing his 2nd year at Baylor College of Medicine, working 90-hour weeks on his clinical rotations, somehow still finding time to call me every Sunday. He was the reason a lot of things mattered that might not have otherwise. His mother and I had divorced when he was 11, and I'd spent too many of his important years absorbed in the demands of work that I told myself was meaningful. And it was, objectively, meaningful. But meaning at scale doesn't replace presence at home. Marcus had grown into a man with more grace than I'd earned the right to hope for, and some days the weight of that generosity was heavier than the gratitude. Hey Dad, how's the attic spit coming? I told him what had happened, straightforwardly, without editorializing, the way I had learned to communicate in the Army. He was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? I'm okay. What about the tuition loan? The last installment? Don't worry about that, I said. I have something in motion. I need you to trust me for about 2 days. He trusted me. He learned to read the steadiness in my voice that meant I wasn't running from something. I was walking toward it at my own pace. Before we hung up, I told him I was proud of him. Not because of the grades, not because of the medical school, but because he'd learned to be a whole person while his father was still figuring out how. He told me to stop talking like that. I told him the truth doesn't stop being the truth just because it's uncomfortable. After I hung up, I drove out to the Lake Houston Wilderness Park, found a bench near the water in the early dark, and sat with the kind of quiet that doesn't exist inside 4 walls. Ray Stanton had brought me out here once, years ago, when we were waiting on a contract decision that would determine whether we had to lay off 40 people. We'd sat for an hour without saying much. Then he said, Daniel, the only thing that survives in flood country is what's built on deep enough footings. He meant the company. He might have meant other things. Ray had passed 8 months ago. I hadn't gone to the office the day after his funeral. I'd gone back to that park. I thought about what he built and what he protected. I thought about Brandon in that conference room, sliding a termination letter across a mahogany desk with the confidence of a man who had never suffered a real consequence. 44 hours. The next morning, I woke to a news alert on my phone. Stanton Civil Solutions stock, they'd gone partially public 3 years prior, was down 11% at opening. Analyst commentary cited personnel uncertainty and questions around the addict's reservoir bid continuity. Someone at the district had clearly said something to someone in the financial press, or the financial press had simply noticed that a $68 million contract bid had just lost its primary technical architect 2 days before the milestone payment on the model used to calculate the entire thing. I went to the gym. I ran the track. I ate breakfast. I did not check my phone for 45 minutes, which is a discipline I recommend to anyone who is waiting for a situation to develop at its natural pace. When I came back, I had 7 missed calls, 4 from numbers I didn't recognize, 1 from Sandra Okafor, 1 from a reporter at the Houston Chronicle's business desk, and 1 from Carolyn Whitfield. I called Sandra back first. She made a formal offer before I'd said more than hello. Director of Structural Engineering, above market compensation, full licensing rights for any models I develop going forward. I told her I appreciated it and to give me 24 hours. I did not call Carolyn back. 22 hours later, I got the call I had been expecting. Brandon Whitfield, his voice had shed its smoothness. There was something underneath it now that I recognized from my time in the field, the specific register of a person who has realized that the ground beneath a structure is softer than the survey indicated. Daniel, I think there was a miscommunication about the timing of your separation. I don't think there was, Brandon. The board is asking questions about the attic submission, about the licensing documentation. That sounds like something your legal team should review thoroughly. We've had people looking at it all night. A pause. There's a clause. There is. Daniel, you have to understand, we didn't know. I know you didn't know. That's the entire problem. I wasn't angry. I passed through whatever anger was available to me somewhere around hour 6. What was left was clarity. Brandon, Ray Stanton wrote that clause because he understood something you don't. The Hargrove model isn't a product. It's not an asset on a balance sheet. It's 22 years of applied engineering knowledge that keeps floodwater out of neighborhoods where families live. He wanted to make sure that if someone without that understanding ever tried to commodify it carelessly, they couldn't. I can reinstate you. Full salary, full benefits, whatever you need, I'm not coming back. Daniel, there are 300 people employed by this company. There are. And most of them are excellent at their jobs. Their employment status is entirely a function of decisions made by your leadership team, not me. I kept my voice even. I'd recommend calling Ray's old general counsel, a man named Thomas Ardell, and asking him to walk you through the transfer documentation. You should also probably call Walter Chen at the district before he calls you. I ended the call. 16 hours. The legal machine began moving with the speed that only genuine financial panic can produce. Thomas Ardell, Ray's counsel, who had written the clause and who I had quietly called 2 days prior, confirmed to Stanton Civil's attorneys that the language was airtight. Carolyn's team attempted to argue that the termination hadn't been effective yet because my access card had technically not been deactivated. Thomas pointed out that Brandon had handed me a signed, dated termination letter and that I had signed the acknowledgement. The termination was real. I found out later that Brandon spent those 16 hours making calls to engineering contacts across the Gulf Coast trying to find someone who could replicate the model's outputs on short notice. The calls did not go well. The Hargrove model had a 14-year implementation track record and was baked into state infrastructure specifications. You cannot reverse engineer a structure that's holding up a levee in a hurricane season. At 9:47 on Thursday morning, my bank account received the annual performance and licensing milestone payment. The amount was $43,000. It hit my account at the exact time specified in my contract. 11 seconds later, a document arrived via encrypted transfer to Thomas Ardell's office. Exclusive licensing rights to the Hargrove load distribution model and all derivative systems transferred permanently to Daniel Hargrove, individual proprietor. $22 million in current assessed licensing value held by a man sitting at his kitchen table in Sugar Land drinking coffee from a Houston Texans mug. My phone rang. Walter Chen. Daniel, My office just received a notice of ownership transfer on the model licensing. Yes, I have to ask, purely for contract compliance purposes, are you in a position to continue supporting the Addicks Reservoir bid? I am, but not through Stanton Civil. The pause that followed had the quality of a man choosing his words the way an engineer chooses load-bearing materials. Would you be open to a conversation about direct engagement? I'd be honored, Walter. That afternoon, I drove to Baylor and found Marcus in the hospital cafeteria between rotations, still in his white coat, eating a sandwich that had clearly been optimistic about its own freshness. He looked up and immediately read something in my face. Dad, what happened? I sat across from him and told him the whole story. He listened the way he'd learned to listen, with patience, completely, without interrupting, tracking the emotional undercurrent alongside the facts. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. The tuition payment, he said. Already processed. I'm not talking about the money, Dad. He shook his head slowly. I'm talking about the fact that you sat on something like that for 72 hours and didn't panic once. The Army teaches you that the outcome of a situation is usually decided before the fighting starts, I said. Ray taught me the rest. Marcus looked at the table. He was 26 years old, and he had his mother's patience and what I hoped was my stubbornness in the right proportions. I want to say something, and I need you to let me say it. Go ahead. You spent a lot of years putting that company before things that deserved more of you. I'm not angry about it. I understand it. But I think maybe this is what it looks like when the right thing happens at the right time. I didn't have a better answer than that, so I let it stand. The press release went out 3 days later. Hargrove Structural Solutions, LLC, a direct licensing and technical consulting entity, had entered into a formal agreement with Harris County Flood Control District for technical support on the Addicks Reservoir expansion. The Hargrove model would continue to be used on the project. A separate licensing arrangement with the Texas Department of Transportation for ongoing state infrastructure projects was announced simultaneously. Brandon Whitfield called me 7 times between Thursday and Monday. I listened to 2 of the voicemails. The first was aggressive and implied legal action. The second, left Sunday night, had a different quality entirely. There was something in the texture of it that I recognized from the field. The sound a structure makes in the seconds before it fails. Not catastrophic yet. Just honest. He asked me to call him back. He said the company was in trouble. He said people were going to lose their jobs. I called Thomas Ardell instead and asked him to confirm that my licensing transfer created no obligation on my part to support Stanton Civil's existing contracts. It did not. I didn't call Brandon back. Not because I wanted him to suffer, because there was nothing I could offer that would fix a problem built on 18 months of decisions that had nothing to do with me. Stanton Civil Solutions filed for Chapter 11 restructuring 7 weeks later. The assets were reorganized. 260 of the 340 employees landed at other firms within 4 months, mostly because the Houston infrastructure community had watched what happened and understood that the talent was real. The problem was at the top. Several of the best engineers called me directly. 6 of them are now part of Hargrove Structural Solutions. Brandon resigned before the restructuring was announced and moved, as I heard it, to pursue opportunities in commercial real estate in Austin. Carolyn took a position with an environmental consulting nonprofit and, by all accounts, is doing good work. Ray Stanton's clause held. It held because he built it on deep enough footings. At Sal's diner, Hector sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man running the structural math in his head. So the bonus, he said. The $43,000. Just the trigger. And the model. $22 million on paper. Closer to 30 in practice, based on the Texas DOT agreement. Danny shook his head, grinning into his coffee. Brandon fired you to save $43,000. He thought he was saving the company money. He thought I was a cost line. Hector leaned forward. What's the lesson? Hector leaned forward. What's the lesson? If you had to say it in one sentence. I thought about Ray on that back porch watching his grandkids chase lightning bugs. About Marcus in the hospital cafeteria in his white coat. About standing at a levee after Harvey and watching the water go where the math said it would go, if you did the work right. Know what you've built, I said. Know what it's worth, and make sure you've got it in writing. And, Danny said, and the people who treat your work like a commodity are usually one contract clause away from finding out what it actually costs. We raised our coffee mugs. It wasn't bourbon on a back porch. But Ray would have understood the gesture. 3 months ago, the Army Corps of Engineers formalized a 5-year direct consulting arrangement with Hargrove Structural Solutions, covering Gulf Coast flood mitigation projects from Beaumont to Corpus Christi. The kickoff meeting was in a conference room in Galveston with 4 Corps engineers and a federal project supervisor who shook my hand for a long moment before we sat down. "Daniel Hargrove," he said, "I've been using your model for 9 years. Glad we're finally talking directly. There's a timer on my desk now. It doesn't count down. It counts up, every morning from 0. A reminder that the hours ahead are resources to be applied with care and precision, not burned in panic. Marcus calls every Sunday. He's doing his surgical rotation now, learning to make decisions in conditions where being slow is as costly as being wrong. He told me last week that one of his attending physicians reminded him that the best surgeons aren't the fastest or the most brilliant, they're the most prepared. I told him I'd heard something similar once, from a man who understood that the structures worth building are the ones still standing when the water rises. He told me to stop being profound at 9 in the morning. I told him to call me next Sunday.